During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, South Carolina operated under rigid racial classifications shaped by slavery, segregation, and eugenics-based thinking. Race determined nearly every aspect of life, including legal status, social mobility, and family legitimacy. Adoption systems, medical institutions, and welfare organizations often worked quietly within these racial hierarchies. Poor women, enslaved or formerly enslaved communities, and marginalized families were especially vulnerable to having their children taken, renamed, or reclassified without consent or transparency. The historical context of South Carolina reveals how deeply race-based systems shaped personal lives and institutional behavior. These structures did not operate accidentally. They were reinforced by law, culture, and economic incentives. Understanding this background is essential to recognizing how such practices could persist for decades without meaningful challenge.
Over time, officials and caretakers repeatedly encountered infants who appeared white or European in physical features, but whose backgrounds were unclear or deliberately obscured. These babies were often labeled white passing, a term used to describe children whose appearance allowed them to be socially categorized as white, despite uncertain ancestry. Their repeated appearance raised questions, yet the system rarely investigated the circumstances of their births. Instead of scrutiny, these cases became normalized within institutional routines. The repeated discovery of white-passing babies was not a mystery that went unsolved. It was a reality that institutions chose not to question. Their appearance disrupted racial boundaries, yet instead of prompting investigation, it exposed how flexible and convenient racial classification could be when power and profit were involved.
A striking pattern in these cases was the absence of fathers' names on birth records. Paternity was frequently omitted, either due to social stigma, coercion, or intentional record manipulation. In some cases, interracial relationships, especially those involving white men and women of color, were concealed to avoid legal and social consequences. By erasing fathers from records, institutions simplified the process of removing children from their biological origins and prevented future claims of identity or inheritance. The systematic absence of fathers' names was a deliberate act of erasure, not a clerical oversight. By removing paternity from official records, institutions severed children from their origins and shielded adults from accountability. This silence became a tool that enabled exploitation while denying children their fundamental right to identity. Once detached from their original identities, these babies were marketed to adoptive families as European, a label that carried social prestige and economic value. Describing children this way reassured adoptive parents and aligned with racial preferences of the time. Adoption agencies and intermediaries often profited from this classification, turning infants into commodities within a racially stratified market. The term European functioned less as a geographic truth and more as a racial guarantee. Labeling these children as European transformed race into a marketable asset. The term masked complex truths behind a simplified and desirable identity, making children easier to sell and harder to trace. In doing so, the adoption system blurred the line between care and commerce, treating human lives as commodities. The long-term consequences of these practices are profound. Families were permanently separated, identities were erased, and generations grew up disconnected from their true heritage. These actions reinforced racial hierarchies while exploiting vulnerable populations. Today, historians and descendants continue to uncover these hidden stories through archives and DNA testing, raising urgent ethical questions about accountability, reparations, and the right to know one's origins. The legacy of these practices still shapes conversations about race, adoption, and historical justice. The legacy of these practices continues to echo through families and communities today. Lost histories, fractured identities, and unresolved injustices demand acknowledgement and accountability. Confronting these truths is not only about correcting the past, but about ensuring transparency, dignity, and ethical responsibility in the present and future.